going to have a brief introduction to Panorama Solutions from Cécile Fatzbert. She's a Program Officer of Solutions at the IUCN Global Protected Areas Program, followed by a presentation of the Envision project by Professor Christopher Raymond. And then we're going to introduce you to the Denali team before getting into the particular research that they're discussing today and the key outcomes from their research in the Denali region. And then we'll have our Q&A session. So I'd like to turn the floor over to Cécile. Cécile, please go ahead.
Thank you, Veronica. And hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. And I'd like to introduce Panorama. So it's a global initiative which promotes solutions from all over the world on that focus on conservation and sustainable development. These solutions have tangible impacts, and it's a way to learn from what works and to not reinvent the wheel. So next slide, please. It's a joint initiative with many partners, many big organizations, including Grid Arendal, World Bank, IFOM Organics, ICROM, RARE, and GIZ, together with IUCN, are forming the secretariat. And there are now 9 thematic communities, so like that help to categorize a little bit the solutions that are submitted to the platform, and all these thematic communities actually are responsible for curating the solutions that come in the platform, but also to somehow activate the communities of practice that they support. Next slide. So in a nutshell, in terms of statistics, as you can see, there are quite many visitors and also a big raise of visitors, for example, from between 2019 and 2020. Now we have more than around 130,000 people who are, let's say, who are visitors that come regularly. We have now over 1,000 solutions on the platform, and the solution come from over 117 different countries, and people visiting are also from almost all the continents. And so Panorama is not only a big platform, so it's an online open access portfolio of solutions, but it's also the different partners, they also organize face-to-face meetings. We call it solutioning events, where practitioners can connect and identify for example, success factors of their solutions and exchange on different challenges and solutions that they have been through. But we also organize every 2 years the Pathfinder Award, for example, which is a contest where a call for proposal for new solutions, and winners are getting funding. We also do a lot of communications, can be solutions in focus, as you see here, but also have like meta synthesis and analysis of the portfolio to see, for example, the last one was about how solutions actually contribute to SDGs. And next slide. And here's testimony from practitioners themselves who already published on Panorama. Is it working?
Now it's working. Yeah.
Okay.
it's more positive. You look into the solution. It's more positive. You look into the solution part because usually you look into problems.
Practitioners really want to learn from each other about what works, what doesn't work. And it's a departure from more traditional approaches to capacity building where an expert or an outside person, maybe a researcher who has studied a solution but really hasn't been involved with its delivery, him or herself, goes and sort of shares that in another location.
Finding solution is very important because then we can actually solve the problem rather than creating the longer list of problems.
So many practitioners around the world have valuable experiences to share and success stories that should be multiplied.
Is located off the southwest coast of Zanzibar and is the first financially self-sustaining marine protected area in the world. We established more than 20 years ago with a very novel concept of developing ecotourism on the island as a not-for-profit business approach to generate all the financing necessary to run a marine protected area.
There aren't many projects like this worldwide. So when you have something as good as this, you have to nurture it, you have to support it, and you have to tell the world about it. Because the world wants to know these kind of things are happening in Papua New Guinea.
And with that, I give back the floor, and I want to thank you, the Envision project, for contributing to the platform. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Cecile, and for showing that very inspiring video. It's been wonderful to partner with IUCN in the Envision research. And we encourage everyone who's attending to check out our other webinars, and we'll post the links to those in the chat box soon. So next, we're going to have an introduction to what the Envision project is all about. We're going to hear from Professor Christopher Raymond. He is the coordinator of the Envision project, and he's Professor of Sustainability Science at the University of Helsinki and a guest professor at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you. I believe you were going to share the screen. Yeah. Excellent. Thanks very much, and welcome everyone to the webinar today. So as Veronica mentioned, I'm the coordinator of the Envision project, and Envision is all about developing an inclusive approach to conservation, largely by eliciting diverse visions for protected areas. And we are today focusing on visions for the future of Alaska's protected areas. But before we go into the Pacific case, I'd like to give you a bit more background to the project. So next slide, please. So we are funded by Biodiversa, which is a joint partnership action and involving both the European Commission through Horizon 2020, the Belmont Forum, as well as national funders, which are listed at the bottom of the screen here. We have a number of university and research partners, including SLU, as Veronica mentioned, Göttingen University, Germany, VU Amsterdam, the Netherlands, University of Illinois, Stockholm Resilience Centre in Sweden, University of Catalonia in Spain, and Edinburgh University, and importantly, IUCN as our science policy interface and SciSeed as our communications interface. Next slide. When we talk about inclusive conservation, we're looking at ways that we can effectively try to balance competing goals for protected areas. That includes managing for economic priorities, social priorities, as well as environmental priorities on the landscape. And we're doing this through trying to find ways to connect people to the development of protected area policies and practices, as well as for improving biodiversity and human well-being. And our approaches seek to consider diverse visions across these economic, environmental and social domains, as well as scenarios for protected area management to look at different ways that they can be brought together for integrated and socially acceptable ways forward. Next slide. And so we've invested a lot of time in the past 3 years of developing mixed methods, participatory scenario planning tools and processes. And we've used those tools to identify, compare, and balance multiple visions for protected areas. We've also tried to assess the social and ecological consequences of different visions for protected area management and used the combined results to make evidence-based recommendations regarding the post-2020 biodiversity policy, including evidence to support the post-2020 biodiversity framework. Next slide. We have 4 case study sites. In addition to Alaska, which we'll hear more about today, we have Sierra de Guatemala in Spain, the Cromer Rhine area in Utrecht, the Netherlands, and the Vasterhagen area in Östergötland in Sweden. Next. In terms of impact, I believe this is my last slide, correct, Veronica? Yes, we have a range of ways of both presenting and assessing our impact. First of all, we've developed these new engagement tools, including Streamline, where we are using these tools to elicit diverse visions for protected areas, and also we use these tools to engage diverse stakeholders in social learning experiments about what could be futures for protected areas given competing goals, as well as different land use management pressures and drivers of change. Today, we will be focusing a lot on PANORAMA and the PANORAMA solutions. The particular solution that we're looking at is in the inclusive conservation through social learning in Alaska protected areas, building upon the PANORAMA tool. Next slide. So yes, I'd like to hand over to the Alaska team now to further focus on the results from the work in Denali. And so over to you, and thank you very much for the opportunity to present on the Envision project.
Thank you, Chris. As you just mentioned here, we'd like to hand over to Karina and William, the research leads from Denali region, so that they can provide an introduction to all the research team members. Over to you, Karina and Bill.
Thanks, Veronica, and welcome everyone. We're really looking forward to the opportunity to share results from our research with communities surrounding Denali National Park and Preserve and Denali State Park. My name is Karina Van Riper, and I'm a faculty member at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I work in a Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences. And so I think a lot about environmental management topics, but from a social science standpoint. So I identify as a conservation psychologist and do work related to human behavior and decision-making in response to different resource management challenges such as climate change, invasive species, and human-wildlife interactions. And I've been fortunate to work in the context of parks and protected areas over the course of my career, and feel very fortunate to be inspired by these landscapes and come to know places that local communities really care about and want to protect in the future. So I'll go ahead and pass it off to my collaborator, Dr. Bill Stewart.
Yes, thank you, Karina, and also Veronica for that nice introduction. Yeah, my name is Bill Stewart. I'm with the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, a colleague of Karina. I'm in the Department of Recreation, Sport, and Tourism. I've done work over my career that deals with community-based conservation, where I care about worked landscapes, those landscapes in which people engage with use of natural resources across various ways and across have viewpoints that are quite different from one another. One of the hallmarks of my research is I like to engage communities to think about ways in which they agree and can move forward from those points of agreement. I've been really fortunate also to work with this Denali team. We've got a stellar group of, I'm going to say, associates and collaborators. We've in part been purposeful about making sure we have the right expertise on this project. So I'm going to pass it on now to Riley to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Riley Andrade. I was a postdoctoral associate with the Denali project over the past year, and I've just had an incredible opportunity to work with this team and to learn from them about ideas of inclusive and community-based conservation. The part of the project that I led was a social learning forum based on community deliberations or discussions about protected area management in the Denali region specifically. So I'll be sharing more about that in a few minutes. I don't want to give too much away. I will pass it off to Devin, who also helped work on this project in relationship to social learning.
Hi, my name is Devin Goodson, and I am a second-year master's student at the University of Illinois. Like Riley said, I helped with the social learning project, but I also worked with some survey results looking to understand what makes people feel included in land management in the Denali region. So yeah, that's a little about me, and I'll pass it off to Dana.
Thanks, Devin. Hey everyone, my name is Dana Johnson, and I'm a recently former master's student at the University of Illinois, and I'm currently a PhD student at the University of British Columbia. I've been involved in this study for about 3 years now and study environmental issues primarily through a social science lens. Within the context of this project, I've been particularly interested in studying local perceptions of social ecological elements that make up the Denali region and potential drivers of change from residents' viewpoints. I've also been interested in exploring how residents' visions for the future of the region align with different changes that might be anticipated in the next 50 years. So with that, I will pass it over to Evan.
Thanks, Dana, and hi everyone. I'm Evan Salcido. I'm a third-year PhD student in Karina's lab. I joined her lab in 2019 and was fortunate enough to be attached to this very interesting project as part of my dissertation research. I work primarily with the interviews that the team did with residents and stakeholders in the Denali region over the course of many years, analyzing those and also analyzing data from the survey that we sent out. And I'm primarily interested in residents' values and sense of place. That's primarily my contribution to the project. So just a bit about me, and yep.
Thanks,
Great.
Evan. I think we could pass things off to Rose now. I believe she's on the call, and there are a few others who will be introducing themselves.
Okay. Certainly, yeah. Let's hand it off to Rose then.
Yes, hello everyone. Hello, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming today. I feel really, first I have to say, I feel really honored to be presenting today with this wonderful team, and especially to many of you who I've lived and breathed and worked with in this wonderful region of Denali. So thank you all for coming today. And thanks to our European colleagues for joining in. so I am formally the social scientist for Denali National Park and Preserve, and was together with this team at the very beginning of the conceptualization process of this project. So I feel honored to be here at coming to the end of this too. And my background is in human geography. Now I have moved to Norway, where I work with the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research, where I continue this work looking into community attachment to place, place change, and protected areas. But what I wanted to bring out in this introduction is how this project has really highlighted and cemented for me a sort of inkling that I had in my work, where in my experience in protected area communities, which is we look a lot at trying to find like the one solution or the one problem to conceptualize and then find a solution around it. And I agree that this is a valid way of approaching things. But what this project has really highlighted over these many years, these few years, with the focus on inclusion, is that a solution focus is important, but it's even more of a focus on the process and procedure and the process of inclusion that we actually really find solutions that we would have never even considered or been able to conceptualize without a focus on the process in which people and voices are heard, incorporated, and taken up into planning. So so this is what I'm taking away from these years, and I hope that all of you who have participated in this work over the last 4 years have also come away with this as well. So yeah, over to Ruth. If she's on the call.
I don't think Ruth is on the call right now, but Jillian has joined us, so I think she's going to introduce herself next. Thanks, Rose.
Yeah, hi, my name is Jillian Rowe, and I'm a recent graduate from the University of Illinois in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences. I was fortunate enough to have Dr. Karina Van Riper as my professor, as well as my research mentor on campus, along with Dana Johnson as my graduate research mentor. So I entered the project in around 2019, I believe, and started mainly with transcription and helping with data entry and organization. And then it eventually evolved into working on a portion of the project that involved creating an institutional map for organizations that are involved in the management of Denali National Park and Preserve and the Denali region in general. And so since I've graduated in May, but I'm really glad to be back here for the final presentation, kind of wrapping some things up and to hear more about what people have been up to since the spring.
Thanks, Jillian. I'm glad that we could take a few minutes just to introduce ourselves, to give you a sense of our starting points and our backgrounds. We'd also like to hear from you all. Moving on to the next slide, you'll see that there is an interactive opportunity for you to plug in locations, protected area locations specifically, to indicate where you have either worked in the past or done research related to protected area management. There are instructions at the top of the screen, so you can use your cell phone and go to menti.com and just type in that code and then put a pin on a protected area location. So as these results pop up on the screen, I'll say that we take a very collaborative and team-based approach to our work. And I think that's reflected in the introductions that, that we've just heard. Many of our questions are sort of co-created with people in local communities that live around protected areas, specifically in the Denali region of Alaska. So our backgrounds and the interests of those local communities have very much mattered in shaping our research questions and our approaches to solving problems and developing the panorama solution that we're going to talk about today. So it looks like the results are rolling in, and there are some there's representation from folks in Europe, different places in the US, and of course, a few from Alaska, which we're really pleased to see. It looks like there's also a comment in the chat box about aspects of Denali management that we're interested in. So we're planning to drill down now and bring that specificity to some of our questions and our motivations with this project and some of the findings. So thanks, Sandy, for that question. Looks like we also have some representation from Africa, which is great to see. We're hoping to reach decision makers, interested residents, and other people that care about protected areas through this webinar. So it's nice to see that broad representation in place, and as well as different places across the US. So thank you very much. It's helpful to paint a picture of who else is on the call, even though we're in the context of a webinar and we can't all turn on our videos. It's nice to see some of these locations popping up on the map. Great. Well, let's go ahead and move forward with some of the slides. We can dive right into our research motivations and, importantly, some of our findings. So I'd like to start with a photo of the protected area that I think about the most. This is a place called Polychrome Pass, and it's one of the many scenic and very revered landscapes in the context of Denali National Park and Preserve in Alaska. Our team has been very fortunate to study and to spend time learning about these kinds of landscapes, and also how surrounding communities are visioning for the future in the face of change. My work in the Denali region started back in 2016, so it's been a nice journey of coming to know this place from a research perspective, which has afforded some wonderful opportunities for asking questions that I think are fundamentally important for environmental conservation. These are questions such as, why do people make decisions about the environment? And what are those broader building blocks that will govern human decision-making and behavior in the context of protected areas? But from a pragmatic standpoint, importantly, how can we most effectively solve conservation problems in a way that is inclusive and engaging of the voices among people that live adjacent to these settings? Moving on to the next slide. As a starting point for motivating our research, I'll say that conservation problems are clearly widespread. I think there would be broad agreement among folks on the call today that this is true. And the evidence is quite clear that landscapes are rapidly changing, as illustrated by the NASA figure showing temperature increases over time, particularly since 1980. So these conditions are causing increasing occurrence of forest fires, melting permafrost, and other noticeable landscape changes that are affecting local communities and places like protected areas that they care about and that they want to see sustained and protected in the future. And so people are responding to these dramatic changes through the development of different policy solutions that are in place to facilitate a conversation about how to address these large scale and very complex problems like climate variability. And so I've highlighted two of these frameworks on this screen that are particularly important for the purpose of our research, including the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is an international treaty that has helped countries to strategize for the conservation of nature, as well as IPBES, which is an organization that was established to improve that interface between science and policy making. And so these initiatives are particularly important outlets that we're hoping to influence in our work. And importantly, these initiatives show that countries are building knowledge and that they are actively taking steps to minimize impacts on local communities from forces like global environmental change. So these policies call for transformations into more sustainable states alongside the more conventional mitigation and adaptation strategies But this is a really complicated process, and it begs important questions like what kinds of transformations are needed and who has a say in this process, and how can we carry out these transformations in a way that's both sustainable and ethical. Moving on to the next slide, I'll say that protected areas are also a tool for conservation initiatives. And they present, I think, a hopeful solution for solving conservation problems. And these areas are very important for many reasons. As I'm sure many of us can appreciate, they protect ecological integrity, tell stories of human history and growth, and generate stewardship. So the reference listed on the lower left-hand corner of the screen, I think, is a nice place to learn about what protected areas represents, and particularly in the context of the US, how they symbolize part of our identity. But consequently, there are a number of ambitious goals that are being proposed to set land aside for the purpose of nature conservation. We see different arguments being made by authors such as E.O. Wilson, suggesting that half of the earth should be set aside for nature conservation, and other conversations about economic implications for proposing that 30% of the world be set aside for nature conservation. And I very much appreciate these calls to action. I think they're important, but I would also emphasize the pragmatics of implementation. And so this is really at the heart of our project. Process is important. I think that setting aside land in protected areas certainly needs to be inclusive, especially in light of the contested history of protected area management in the US, and a tendency for US protected areas to think about visitors and manage for people that come to protected areas from the outside rather than the interests of local communities. And so one of the important launching points for our project was to shift attention from tourists to local communities to think about that process for building an inclusive conservation about conservation and protected area management in the Denali region of Alaska. And moving on to the next slide, the stated purpose of our project is to understand multiple viewpoints and those interests in protected area management, decision-making, and thinking about the future. So we've moved through 4 different phases of research to come to know the communities surrounding Denali National Park and Preserve, starting back in 2018. We began with in-depth discussions through listening sessions, focus groups, and interviews that were conducted to characterize the region and understand different drivers of change, as well as important aspects of the community and the landscape that people wanted to protect and preserve in the future. This laid groundwork for a broader regional assessment within interior Alaska and across the state to understand and quantify preferences among competing conditions and preferences for future growth. This work was helpful in the backdrop it provided to understand social learning. And this is what we're going to drill down on today, to hear about some of the findings regarding how people have responded to discussions and learned from one another, envisioning for their future within the Denali region. And I'll say that throughout, we are working to develop forums for dialogue about our project findings. This is very applied research that cares about getting results back to local communities and practitioners to inform decision-making through our sort of sequential process of research in Alaska. So I'll ask Dr. Bill Stewart to now chime in to build on some of the points that I've shared about our study purpose in the Denali region.
Yeah, thanks, Karina. And just to add to the good stuff that you'd mentioned there, this notion of a mixed method study design, we're believers in that each method provides a little bit different insight, a different lens to look at what's going on in the local communities there. So we brought to bear on our phases of research, there was this developmental approach where they built on each other. It was a cumulative sense of knowledge. Not only did we introduce ourselves to the community there, but they introduced us to themselves to us. It was a collaborative learning experience in many ways. Next slide, please. And I'd like to orient you to the geography of the place we studied, the Denali region. On the right side of the screen, the upper right side, the small scale map is it's a global map of northern North America. The United States is barely in there, the continental US, but there's a chunk off to the northwest. That's Alaska. And we're technically not in an Arctic zone. We're just subarctic. We're just below the Arctic Circle. And off to the left there is the inset where that arrow is in that map, the communities of the Denali region. And you can see the darker green inset is Denali National Park and Preserve. To give you a sense of the scale of land there, that park is 6 million acres, or around, it's just close to 25,000 square kilometers. And the road that you see shooting into the park, that is the westernmost road in North America that's actually attached to the general road system. So if you go to villages west or north or southwest of there, you typically have to go by other means besides a car, often by bush plane, or maybe by boat if you're along the coast. We really concentrated our efforts on the rural communities that flow between Fairbanks, Alaska, and Trappers Creek down on the bottom of that screen. There's about 10 or so. They're largely rural. If you were to drive through them, if it wasn't for a gas station, on some of them you're not quite sure if you passed through the community. But they're filled with people who care about the area. They purposely have lived up there. And we were excited about each one having in many ways, its own personality that we came to know. You can see here down at the bottom of those pictures there, dog sledding is still a way of life for several Native Alaskans and people who live in there. We've got in lower elevations and down to the south of our geography, you've got some spruce, otherwise it's largely tundra as a landscape. And then off to the far right, that photograph of a subsistence user at fish camp, where in the summertime, they collect their fish that they consume during the rest of the year. So next slide, please. And our research was an iterative process that brought out these multiple perspectives. We made a point of, we're very conscious of living in the lower 48 here in the state of Illinois. So we'd go up there a few times a year prior to the COVID pandemic. And we would partake in their collaborations with, here on the bottom left of the screen is Healy celebrated their 100-year anniversary on the 4th of July, that event. We also took tours of, let's say, Clear Air Force Station. We were keen on understanding and engaging with the interest groups there across various fronts of activity that dealt with education in the local schools, environmental management, not just with the national park there, but state lands also. Mass tourism, which was quite different than other sort of mom and pop tourism or small scale tourism. And we realized that there are subsistence users that are both indigenous as well as non-native subsistence users. There's a thriving energy industry there, as well as local businesses, government, and then the military. And I want to draw your attention to that pentagon down there at the bottom, which sort of shows the cycle in which we operated in, of building partnerships. That was a common thread that ran throughout our time in Denali. We wanted to understand place as one of our phases that led to founding and anchoring our language of our questionnaire into visioning for the future. It then led to a social learning experiment that Riley will talk about in a bit here. And then we're in this reflection stage where we've developed a draft technical report. We're currently engaging our local partners, or re-engaging them with comments that they might have. We want to make sure that our research is, as Chris said earlier in the talk here, it's about evidence-based recommendations. And in this case, the evidence is about evidence from the people who live there. They know the area well. They're the people that have a high stake in its future. And the thrust of the study is to make sure we're faithful and do justice to that. I'm going to pass it on I'm going to pass along here. Is it Riley who's next?
Yeah, can you
Yes,
go ahead
thank
and
you.
advance the slide?
Thank you, Bill, and Karina for providing that context to the research. It's fantastic to hear about the context and these drivers that are shaping protected areas management. And indeed, now we do have Riley Andrade, who's joining us as a postdoc at the University of Florida. She introduced herself earlier. I just let her take the floor. Over to you, Riley.
Thank you so much. So hi, everyone. I'll be transitioning the talk now to focus on the main components of the PANORAMA solution that focused on social learning. So to do so, I thought it'd be fun to present you with a similar prompt that Denali residents answered as part of a series of discussions about protected area management. So thinking about the social and biophysical features of that protected area that you listed earlier, what are the qualities that are the most special about this place? You can navigate to Mentimeter again using that same code as before to answer this question. And in there, it will give you, I think, 3 to 5 words that you can enter, and it will create the software will start creating a word cloud from all of your responses. So it'd be great to see what are some of those special qualities about protected areas that you care most about. As people start entering their responses, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the responses from residents of interior Alaska. So some of the key qualities that they valued were a tight-knit community and an Alaskan way of life. They also valued wilderness and recreation. We have some other ones coming in here. I just saw recreation pop up. Beauty, biodiversity seems to be at the front and center here of this word cloud. So we're thinking about both in environmental benefits, so thinking about biodiversity, the plant, wildlife, non-human life that these landscapes provide, and then also some of the subsequent qualities that include health and recreation, a chance for solitude. We have people chiming in here. We have the word inclusivity and wildlife both coming through. So it looks like wildlife, biodiversity, recreation right now are first and foremost. We also have another one up here that's interesting, thinking about respect and maybe some of these contentious areas where a lot of stakeholders are sharing this space, same space. Feeling rooted, I really like the feeling rooted one and having somewhere that you connect to. So some of these conceptions of space. I think that looks like replies, word cloud isn't moving quite as quickly now. So I think we've starting to triangulate on some of these qualities, which is really interesting to know, thinking about the spans of protected areas that range from Alaska over into Europe. And then we also have a few attendees from Africa as well. So it's really interesting to see how this might span different countries and protected area contexts and some things that maybe are universal to and come through no matter where you are. So thanks for everyone for sharing those special qualities. I mentioned that we asked a similar question to Alaska residents, which was part of a larger series of community deliberations to focus on the idea of social learning. So if you want to go ahead and advance the slide now, we can talk about a little bit more about the social learning forum. So one of the main components of the Denali Panorama solution focused around social learning about protected areas. Go ahead. In particular, we use community deliberation about the landscape, including questions similar to the ones you just answered, to identify shared values, clarify differences, and facilitate learning. We also considered, if learning occurred, how that might potentially create value shifts of the people participating in a forum as a result of learning from others. So next slide. I know that social learning is a fairly contested topic, or maybe one that you're not familiar with, and it has multiple definitions. The one we were using in this context is the change in understanding that occurs through social interactions, like discussion amongst actors in a network. The learning that occurs between individuals and organizations then goes on to become situated within broader communities of practice. Social learning can occur as formal interventions, such as discussing the co-benefits and trade-offs of a particular management scenario during a public comment period, but it also happens informally throughout people's daily lives. We are constantly learning from one another, and we apply this learning to the broader context in which we function. Okay, next slide. We considered value shifts to encompass an array of value types. These included social values, which are place-based qualities assigned to a landscape that provided benefits to society. They're specific to a particular place. Next, we also looked at self-transcendence values, including altruism or the value of other humans, and then biospheric values of the natural environment. These self-transcendence values serve as guiding priorities in life that go beyond one specific context. Finally, we also looked at eudaimonic values that are enduring belief about well-being based on self-actualization and excellence. So we engage people in a series of conversations to facilitate social learning amongst people participating in those discussions. And then we looked to see how these different levels of values may have shifted as a result of those discussions. So go on to the next slide. And this highlights the three objectives that kind of go across that process. So objective 1 of our research process was characterizing community discussions about protected area management through participation in an online discussion forum. This is what we use to facilitate the social learning process. Then we examined how social learning occurred amongst residents with different values and shared understandings of protected areas. And then finally, we looked to understand how social learning may affect the values of community members. Next slide. To answer these questions, we engaged in a series of discussions with participants living in the Denali region. They were identified through a survey administered earlier in the summer of 2020. We started the discussions with a virtual meet and greet for the participants to get to know each other, and then also the research team. Unsurprisingly, due to the tight-knit community, some people already knew each other who participated in these discussions. About 35 residents in total were sorted into 3 smaller discussion subgroups based on their values, and then engaged in a series of online deliberations related to protected area management over the course of 4 weeks. After the deliberations, the participants retook the survey, which is what we use to measure value shifts before and after participation in the forum, followed by a wrap-up webinar with those who participated to share the results of how they link to the broader project. And now I'll pass it on to Devin, who will talk a little bit more about what that forum actually looked like and the results of people participating in it.
Hello, everyone. So if you can go to the next slide for me. So over the course of 4 weeks, 37 participants left 460 comments on the Denali discussion forum. And these comments ranged from short agreements to someone else's post all the way to multi-paragraph responses with links to references and other resources. However, the general format looked like what is displayed on this slide. So one participant would respond to the week's prompt, and other residents would reply to that post, and a natural conversation would ensue over the course of a week. So while all the participants were responding to the weekly prompt, they were also freely engaging with each other. So now we'll move on to the results, and we'll look at what the residents actually talked about. So we will start things off with the benefits of living in the Denali region, which are written in the green text in the upper left-hand corner. So for many participants, there was this idea of an Alaskan way of life that was present in Denali. The region allows for unique freedoms, and the residents get great satisfaction from living with less in the harsh environment. Additionally, part of the Alaskan way of life is solitude and silence. And the solitude and silence allows for a greater appreciation of the wilderness and the natural beauty of the Denali region. But this solitude doesn't mean there aren't close-knit connections and communities full of really helpful and supportive people. Now, threats to the region are in the upper right-hand corner and are written in orange. And they include climate change, which has led to thousands of beetle-killed spruce trees and increased fire risk. Tourism, which serves as a livelihood for some, but wields an uncomfortable amount of influence for others. And lastly, development and growth in the region, which treats land primarily as a resource. Now, participants also explicitly discussed land management, and some of their key concerns are written in blue in the lower left-hand corner. So these concerns included environmental preservation, bridging the gap between residents and land managers, and land use planning. One recommendation to improve current land management practices were community-led planning efforts, because when it's the community leading it, it's not a big government boogeyman. Lastly, in the lower right-hand corner, written in purple, The residents identified what currently guides land management. And one resident noted that every agency has people that care. They, however, are not the decision makers. Residents also examined what guided their views around land management. Some of these influences included indigenous stewardship and pursuit of a full life. So now that we kind of have like a thematic understanding of what the residents talked about, now it's time to ask, how did the residents learn during the online discussion forum? So if we can flip to the next slide. So cognitive learning was the least emphasized. And this finding makes sense because residents are familiar with the Denali region. We might expect to see higher cognitive learning if there were people from the outside of the Denali region who participated, as through their conversations, they would have likely learned about the history of the area. Normative learning was the second most common form of learning, and normative learning was centered around expectations for land management. In particular, the expectation that decision-making should better reflect the values of local communities. And finally, we have relational learning, which included changes in understanding other people and building relationships. And this type of learning was prevalent among all of the study participants. There was variation among the three groups, but not enough to be statistically significant. So ultimately, group composition based on values did not shift the importance of relational learning. And now we'll move on to objective 3. And we'll look at our theoretical model to see how learning impacts value shifts. But before we get to the results of the model, I just want to quickly walk through the variables. So we have learning types, which are cognitive, normative, relational, and those were qualitatively measured from the discussion post. And then we have situated learning, which was defined as residents who situated their learning within broader context, and they discussed what they had learned during the forum outside of the forum with other people. There's also individual learning, defined as residents who learn through active engagement in the forum. And with both of those, they were measured on a 5-point scale across a series of questions related to the participants' experience during the forum. And then finally, we have multi-level value shifts, what Riley touched on towards the beginning, which included eudaimonic, self-transcendent, and social values. And we examined these values before and after the Denali discussion forum, and then calculated that shift based on the difference between the two. So if we can go on to the next slide. So overall, value shifts were subtle, but they did vary with situated and individual learning. Participants that situated their learning within broader context were more likely to rate self-transcendent values as more important after the forum. Participants who engaged in individual learning, or in other words, those who learned through active engagement during the forum, were more likely to rate social values as more important after the forum. So overall, learning explained the greatest degree of shift in social learning values, followed by self-transcendent and eudaimonic values. So now that we've kind of walked through that model, Riley's going to hop back on here and we're going to talk about some conclusions. And then we have another interactive question for you all.
Okay, you can go ahead and advance the slide. Yeah, so this is just a quick overview for the sake of time. We'll just kind of focus on some of the main conclusions, and then after that we'll move forward and think about more of a conversational approach to social learning. So for one of the first things that we learned from the Social Learning Forum is that climate change, tourism, and development were listed as potential threats to Denali's natural beauty or wilderness, ideals of wilderness, and Alaskan way of life, and tight-knit communities. Residents participating in the forum were also eager to find ways to bridge the gap between land managers through representing and amplifying diverse community voices. So that was really emphasized as well, the need to engage people from different groups. Relational learning was the most important. That's learning by changing or growing your understandings of others and how your position relates to the position of others. Whereas cognitive learning, that's about facts and experiences occurred less than expected. We did not detect differences in learning types amongst residents that held different values. So the person's value going into the forum, that value group that they're placed into didn't necessarily change the dimensions of learning. And one of the reasons was because of this like really big emphasis on relational learning within the forum. And that happened no matter what types of values someone came into the forum with. Changes in values were subtle, but were a result of social learning within the forum by actively engaging and taking that learning and situating it within the broader context. And then learning also explained a greatest degree of shifts in social values assigned to the landscape. That makes sense because those values are really specific and about that place that people talked about for 4 weeks. Followed by self-transcendent values that go beyond any one given context. And then finally, eudaimonic values experience the lowest amount of shifts due to learning. So that follows what we might assume based on eudaimonic and self-transcendent values being these really broad things that are these driving priorities in life. So we might not expect engagement in a 4-week discussion forum to shift those sorts of values, whereas we did see them shifting those more specific values about the landscape. So if you can go on one more slide. The next slide I'll be transitioning to after this one is about the implications of the project. But first, I wanted to take a step back and gauge your input about social learning and protected area management. So I wanted to open this up to a little bit of discussion here from the attendees. So what challenges do you think would benefit from social learning and using social learning applied to help address management of protected areas? You can think about the particular protected area that you work within, or think about protected area management more broadly. So you want to navigate to Mentimeter again. This is an open response question. It would just be great to think if anyone else has been thinking about the use of learning and people interacting with one another and learning from each other and how we might use that in protected area management. So for instance, social learning in the case of the Denali study was particularly useful to help address previous underlying tensions, especially through relational learning. So many of the participants noted that this learning-based frame created a less contentious space to address issues that people felt really passionately about. So social learning created a space and in turn an increase in understanding between groups who may have had different values and perspectives. This can help alleviate some of the challenges in areas of many involved stakeholders. Yeah, so someone asked about social learning, counteracting the tragedy of the commons or wildlife with large ranges. Yeah, I would also think about social learning in terms of like human-wildlife conflict, and you have areas where people are interacting really closely with the landscape, addressing recreation, access and development inside and outside the park. Low public support of conservation. I think that that's key here. So thinking about social learning as a process and what we were saying earlier about having an inclusive process. So one of the ways we might counteract low public support is by having people more actively engaged in thinking about the process. When managers are not from a region or do not know or identify with the local people, in the Denali region, sometimes residents can feel at odds with protected area managers and feel like their voice isn't represented. So this might be a way that we would think about having managers and residents who intimately know the landscape to learn from one another. It's a good start for laying the foundation of the history and management in an area. Types of access and capacity planning. These are all really great ideas and things that we thought about as well. So if we want to go forward one slide, and I'll wrap up talking about the implications of the study. Thank you all for including your responses there. Can we move forward one slide? So within the Denali region specifically, here are the few implications or the ways that we thought we could address some challenges with social learning and participation through an online discussion forum. We use social learning and that online discussion forum to identify shared values and also to negotiate value differences and present opportunities to align groups of stakeholders, especially those who maybe hadn't been actively talking to each other, including residents, managers, and researchers. Relational learning was most likely to occur, at least within our particular context, and provided a basis for consensus building, but also as a way to identify different points of view as well. So I really want to emphasize this. There was this shared understanding that was created, but it also created the space for people with different perspectives to come and talk to each other in a context of respect and learning from one another. And it also helped us understand the priorities of visitors and residents. So recentering the way we think about protected area management to also really actively think about residents as local knowledge experts. And then there are also a few implications here about online discussion forums. I could probably talk about this for the next hour, but there was a lot of benefits about conducting this in an online space, especially in rural contexts where someone maybe would have to, get on the plane and fly 30 minutes to be able to participate in the forum if it would have been in person. But there was also a unique set of challenges that we had to think through when constructing the forum to make sure that people had access and technology to actually engage. I guess I'll do one more ending point and then send it off to Dana. And then my ending point is that deliberation and social learning are complex topics, which we need explicit consideration to be included as a goal to better integrate people and local residents and their views of the landscapes into research and especially protected area management. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Riley, for sharing that, and Devin for sharing all of that wonderful research that you're doing regarding social learning. So learned a lot from that presentation and hope that our guests have as well. So now we'd like to shift to Dana, who is currently a doctoral student at the University of British Columbia, and she's going to share some of the outputs that have come out from this Denali research and how we're trying to connect that to policy. So over to you, Dana.
Yeah, thank you, Veronica. And thanks, Riley and Devin. I'll be brief here because I know we're at the end of time, but throughout our study, it's been a primary goal of ours to report on findings in multiple ways, accessible to those in the study community, the public, practitioners, and the broader scientific community. One of these recent outputs of ours is a fact sheet, which you can see a screenshot of on the screen. This reports on findings from our study throughout, but with a particular focus on the social learning results that were just presented. This fact sheet is meant to be accessible to a range of readership, including practitioners and scientists. We have published this, and there should be a link coming through in the chat that takes you to a PDF version on our website in case you'd be interested in perusing. This document includes an overview of inclusive conservation, the Denali case study, and a comprehensive report of the Social Learning Forum findings that were shared here today. So if you're interested in learning more and looking through those details, feel free to take a look and reach out to any of us if you have questions. Next slide, please. So our project has also culminated in some other deliverables. And thus far, this has been a series of outputs, including 2 technical reports that are underway, which comprehensively report on all phases of our research over the past 3 years. Several peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed deliverables that have been published or are in the process of being published. Broader pieces of engagement, including 3 newsletters that we circulate with those included in our study, 2 webinars, engagement with a local knowledge alliance of key leaders in the Denali community, and 16 conference presentations. If you would like to learn more about any of these initiatives, I'm going to share a link in the chat to our project website. Particularly if you look at the deliverable pages, you'll see all of those citations and documents, links to the newsletters and other things we have going on. And as always, feel free to reach out to us with any questions you have about our study or the deliverables within our website. Thank you.
Great, wonderful, Dana. Thank you for providing that overview. And thank you to the Denali team members overall for presenting the research. So far, we've had a broader overview of the research in the Denali region and the context and the drivers that are shaping protected areas management that Bill and Karina shared, and then some specific research on social learning that was shared by Riley and by Devin. So now we come to the exciting interactive part of our PANORAMA webinar. And now we'd like to invite everyone to participate in a question and answer period. We've had some questions that have been posed in the chat box and in the Q&A. as well. And some of those have already been answered. So we encourage you to please, continue to raise your hands if you have a question, or type them in the chat box. Maybe we can go over to our Q&A just for the benefits of our guests, see what kinds of questions have been already asked. So we have had someone asking about when we can hear from community representatives regarding the project. And we do have a member of the Local Knowledge Alliance in Denali who is speaking after this talk, Stuart Leidner, who is working for Alaska State Parks. And Karina has shared with us the link to join the presentation that will occur following this webinar. So we're going to take a 10-minute break and then have another webinar, another presentation by Stuart. So that's great. And Sandy has asked us if we have included members of the Denali Subsistence Resource Commission and the South Central Subsistence Regional Advisory Council. So Karina and Bill have responded to that. And I wonder if Karina and Bill, you want to just quickly elaborate on your answers here while we allow our guests to think about any additional questions that they have. So Karina and Bill?
Sure. I appreciate this question because it gets at this idea of representation. And this was really at the heart of the project. We worked to identify key interest groups and engage with those groups in different ways. And the context that Bill had shared in his aspect of the presentation had outlined some of the criteria that we had used to sort of focus our interests based on geography, and then also based on those key voices within the local community that we tried to understand and engage. I noted in the response that we did engage with members that were part of the Subsistence Resource Council and heard from different perspectives in that way, mostly through one-on-one conversations and interviews. The two groups that were mentioned were not part of the executive committee that had guided the study or formally engaged. I think this also speaks to the broad regional scale at which we were working, which I think was a nice sort of clear contribution from the work to work at such a broad geography, but there's certainly a number of stakeholder groups that we haven't yet heard from or engaged with. Bill, any points to add there?
Yeah, if I could add, thank you, Karina. That was good stuff there. One of the issues with inclusive conservation, when you try to be exhaustive, trying to engage with every group imaginable that might be on the landscape there, there's always some that you don't engage with, or we don't contact. So clearly we left out some groups. I will say with the Subsistence Resource Commission, we have brought some of the people on that commission as members into our study, but whether or not they represented the SRC or represented themselves, we weren't always formal about who are you representing. And I'm with Karina on this point about representation is so important to inclusive conservation. And when we reach out, it sort of implies that we want people to come into the dialogue, and that doesn't always happen. Some people, for several good reasons, may not want to be part of the dialogue. So we do the best that we can. I'm going to say it's an aspiration and ideal as much as anything.
Great, thank you very much for that, Bill and Karina. We do have a follow-up question from Sean Williams from the Hoona Indian Association. So thank you so much for this question, Sean. Sean is asking if this research is going to be replicated in other areas of Alaska. So would any team members like to answer that question?
Well, I'll say that I do hope that it is. Right now, we've focused on coming to know and understand the Denali region, which has taken quite a bit of time. I appreciated earlier in the conversation that there was acknowledgement that we were coming in as outsiders, and we positioned ourselves as sounding boards where we could hear from people and then to report back on what we had observed. And this takes a while to come to know places and build that trust and sort of position ourselves with a clear understanding of our intentions as a research team. So we're still in the thick of it with reporting on our current results in interior Alaska. And I do hope we can continue to work in the region and be inspired by that place, but we don't currently have any projects slated to reach into other areas across the state?
Yeah, thanks, Sean, for that great question. To add to what Karina said, I think we would love to do something like that. I think a big part of our work that really excites us is that we not only take the act of representing people's voices, that's such a serious and important trust, that it requires trust and it requires credibility. We take that seriously in terms of reflecting back what people think. And the interesting thing that what we found is that many times communities don't know each other. And a big part of our research is a final phase that we're going into now has to do with sharing our results with other people, where we basically reflect back to the community the voices that we heard. And we're always surprised in the various places we've worked across our careers at the people who realize they've come to know each other in that process of, I'm going to say, evidence-based sort of learning, where we share with them what they have come to know. And I'm going to call it a kind of civic discovery. They learn about themselves and each other and how they fit in with their community. And that's a really neat part. I mean, we all have different reasons why we get into the business we are, but for my research and my team members here, we really care about not only representing people and taking that seriously, but representing them in a collective way. And those are two different kinds of things there. And the collective way, in many ways, is a discovery process that's not something that's evidence. It's almost like a creative part of what we do. And so I'm just going to stop there, Sean, but thank you for that question.
Thank you, Bill and Karina, and thank you, Sean, for that question. And Sean has followed up with an additional comment here in the box where he notes that if you find additional funding, Glacier Bay National Park and the Hoona Indian Association would be a great focus area, and he has included his contact information there, and he's asking and noting the earnest need for more structured community engagement processes. We do have a couple other questions in the question and answer box, and I note that we have several minutes left. So let's go through these questions, and then we'll have a brief break, and then we'll go into the presentation by Stuart, and we'll add the Zoom link again in the chat box so that our participants can join. All right, so let's go to Teresa Floberg's question. She's asked the team, what action items have come out of the conclusions drawn from the study? So here I open the floor to anyone from the Denali team who would like to answer this question. And I note that we've got several other questions coming in. So that's great to see such dynamic questions and answer discussion by the team. So anyone from the team would like to answer Teresa's question? Or maybe Riley or Dana, perhaps, or Devin?
Yeah, I'll speak quickly, and I probably won't capture everything, Bill, so I'll leave room for you to maybe talk about some more research things. I'll just talk about the action item that we're working on right now that includes this particular webinar, but also a series of discussions, and we highlight this in the Panorama solution that we're viewing this as a wheel. So one of the things that we're taking out of the social learning forum is bringing together these voices and creating this new baseline then to move forward for future discussions and thinking about protected area management. So we're thinking about this as being a continual process of relationship and trust building. So one of the ways that we're doing that as a research group is going back across some of these different potential like stakeholders or interested parties. So things like this webinar where we're talking in more of a research or a management focus, but then 2 weeks ago, we also had a brown bag that was focused in, that was hosted by Denali National Park that focused more on the residents and the people living in the region. We've also had started discussions with the executive committee, so thinking about regional leadership in the area and using that to move the conversation forward and thinking about this as a continual process. But I'll let you, Bill or Karina, add more on that.
Just adding there, thanks, Riley. My thoughts are that we're still in the process of mulling over what it is our action items are. That takes a lot of, it's hard to disentangle the evidence that's descriptive and explanatory into sort of the prescriptive mode. So we're still working on those connections of what we found descriptively, and then moving forward prescriptively, what are we suggesting should happen? But we will say that one thing that we've heard loud and clear from many of the residents of the area is that the act of representation can be highly nuanced, and to the point where just to recognize for land agencies to recognize that they heard people's voices. Some people want to actually read the reports and at some point see their voice reflected in that. Let's say in appendices where their stories were told, or let's say omitted from the appendices. Simple things about clarification about how decisions will be made, a little bit more transparency in that. I mean, it's interesting how agencies, I'm going to say for the past 100 years, have been opening up and becoming more transparent. They've become a sunshine on the way decisions are made. But there could always be more sunshine. There can always be more transparency in the way decisions are made. And I think that's a huge part of inclusive conservation, is the notion of transparency and how people's expectations come to understand what are the deadlines for submission of comments. Just very simple things like that can make a big difference in the way, I'm going to say, people react, and that trust sort of builds itself or decreases. I'll just stop it there and let Karina or someone else chime in there.
Thank you, Bill. I see that Karina's typing an answer, and that's great. So while she's finishing that, I wonder if you just want to quickly say something, Karina, but just in the interest of time, I'm wondering if we should go over to the next questions that we have here. Go ahead, Karina.
No, I'm actually not typing in an answer. I was just hoping to respond to this and then also address one of the other questions that was asked about how you can sort of leave communities with information that enable them to make more informed decisions in the future, because this was very much important for our project, with the understanding that we were researchers coming in from the outside to make observations and synthesize this information at a regional scale. So we were sort of uniquely positioned to facilitate the learning process between different communities that may or may not have been previously connected. And so we have worked to develop, I guess, sort of deliverables or action items that people could draw from in the future as they make their own decisions, because we aren't planners necessarily. But we did develop a web page. I am wondering if this could be posted by Riley. She led the social forum and this online facilitation that took place over the course of the month. And we set up this sort of infrastructure where there's information from the social learning forum and the exchange that happens with Denali communities, but that could potentially be used for educational purposes or replicated in some way in the future. So all of that is publicly available, and it could be a launching point for enabling communities to make decisions.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that, Karina. Let's just turn over to the comments made by John Dennis from the National Park Service. So John has noted here that for comparison, it would be interesting to do a companion study based on a national wildlife refuge. And he also followed up by asking, how do you account for interest of the groups that don't join in the online deliberations? So could you respond to this question to anyone from the Denali research team?
I'm going to jump in again here. John, thank you for those questions. They're excellent. And we've been haunted and struggling with that last one about how do we account for those voices that didn't want to join or that we missed. And I would say that that's part of the reason for the mixed methods that we've employed. That each person, a community or group has their differences in terms of the way they want to be approached or what they'll give voice to. It's not unusual. I've had people here in the Midwest here who will travel an hour just to talk and have conversations and be a member of a focus group. But will they fill out a 5-page questionnaire? No, they won't, but they will talk. So the notion of different methods becomes important. And I will say that that's part of the reasons why we were creative in the development and application of our methods. We purposely explored new ways of engaging people through methodology that has not been used before. And that's really helped us with some of the groups. However, there's still some groups that were left out. So, you know, at what point does that end? But at least an initial layer to responding to your question, Dennis, is to say that we have to be creative with the methods we use to, I'm just going to say to describe and represent the voices of people who care about the area.
All right, would anyone else from the team like to elaborate on this? We have just, you know, it's such a lively discussion and I hate to end it. You know, we do have, you know, some time that we could spend maybe a few minutes before we take a quick break and then transition to the next presentation by Stuart Leidner. I've posted the link to access that meeting in the chat box. But a quick reaction from anyone from the team, and then I'll go over the other comments that have been posed in the question and answer box. Okay, great. So I do want to note that Jamie Trammell has asked, how would you set up a program or infrastructure so that communities can continue the social learning? And she notes that communities are fairly transitional, that could lead to further challenges in creating a sense of place. So that's a very interesting point that Riley has already responded to. Riley, I just wonder if you wanted to elaborate for very quickly before we go to the other question in the session.
Yeah, I can elaborate quickly, but I think Karina, that was the question that Karina was answering as well too, was thinking about how to, you know, incorporate this different voices and leading this conversation on. And part of that answer was posting the Denali discussion resource. So the actual discussion forum is closed because it's only for the residents that participated in the forum. So we kept those conversations private. But we also have included a lot of resources about the summary of those discussions. And those discussion boards are actually still open to the participants in the background. And we've been having some ongoing discussions about how we might create and or use a similar sort of resource in the future. In particular, the participants noted that something like this would be really helpful, especially in the rural context, to have a forum space where people could come together, especially before public comment periods or when different decisions were made by various levels of management, where the public could share information with each other prior to these meetings and these public input periods. So we're still in open discussion thinking about what some good ways might be to do that and keep these discussions going beyond the end of the research study.
Great, thank you for that, Riley. And finally, this is a great transition question and a segue to the next presentation. So Teresa Floberg is asking about the topic of the next presentation. And Karina here has noted that she'd like to answer this question live. So please go ahead, Karina and Bill. You know, if you are able to maybe provide a brief introduction, and then I'll thank everybody and we can move on to a quick break and then to the next presentation.
Sure. I'll say that the next presentation will be given by Stuart Leidner, who is a member of our executive committee and has been one of those guiding voices in our research process. And so we're planning to open up a conversation about the region and some of the challenges that are faced from the protected area management standpoint. So he'll talk for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we have a whole 30-minute block of time set aside to engage in questions and answers. So I think if you'd like to talk further about protected area management challenges in the region, this would be a great space to do that. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Karina. So we're reaching the end of our time here together before we take a quick break and move on to Stuart's presentation. So we're really looking forward to that. But before we leave, I just want to, I joined the Denali team in thanking everyone for joining us from all these different countries. Great to hear your questions, see what regions you're working on, and have our really lively discussion session with you. So thank you to the Denali team for sharing your exciting research, and a really big thank you to our host, IUCN, so Cecile, and those that haven't spoken but have a really important role in connecting us to policy, and that's Barbara Battioni and Alberto Arroyo Chanel, who have been working hard behind the scenes. So I hope our attendees can stay on for the presentation, and the Zoom link had been posted in different places before. So I'll just put it in the chat box again, just to encourage everybody to join. And that would be in about 5 minutes. Okay. So thank you, everyone. We'll see those of you who are joining soon, but those who are not, thank you again for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.